Eric Foner's here today to talk a little bit about his work, and he's come to Oklahoma for a lecture at the University of Oklahoma, and while you were here you went to OSU as well.
I did.
Your work is mostly focused on the 19th century. Why is that important to us today?
Well, I think a lot of the issues that are still in our society, pick up the daily newspaper and you'll see it, revolve around the issues of race, of federal-state relations, of economic equality and its relation to political democracy. These are all Civil War era questions. You know, they were fought over at that time. The struggle against slavery could be seen as a precursor of the civil rights movement of, you know, the last generation. Issues like who is a citizen, who should be allowed to be a citizen, that's a Civil War era question. The Reconstruction era, the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which created birthright citizenship, that's still controversial today. So, you know, a lot of the issues in our society today really come out of that question of slavery, the struggle against slavery, and what is going to be the status of African Americans in our society after slavery was abolished. And we're still kind of debating that nowadays.
And with other populations of immigrants and things,
right, of course, the template is no longer just blacks and whites. The racial and ethnic configuration of the country has become much more diverse since then. But the question, you know, who is an American and who has a right to be an American is still on the agenda right now, and it was fought over in the Civil War era.
And the presidency of Abraham Lincoln was in the middle of all of that, and how important was he to America and where we are today?
Lincoln is a central figure. You can't really understand American history without coming to terms with Lincoln in some form, you know, and I think Lincoln it's a combination. He was representative of his society, at least Northern society. He started out as a very poor man. He was an ordinary person, grew up on a small farm, you know, but then through education, through talent and whatever drive, ambition, he rose to, you know, become a leader of the society. And the thing that he exemplified was, I think, and what I argue about him, I argue in my book, is that he had the capacity to grow. You know, the greatness of Lincoln is that he was able to rise to the occasion at a time of crisis, at a time of rapid change. He didn't just stick with his old views. He was open-minded. He was willing to listen to criticism, and you know, he became a central. He didn't do everything all by himself. Nobody does. You know, right. Lincoln didn't quote unquote free the slaves just with a stroke of his pen, but his actions were central to what happened in that era.
What have you learned about him that maybe most of us aren't taught or don't understand about him? Is there anything surprising?
Well, when I was writing about Lincoln, you know, and I've taught 19th century history a lot, so Lincoln has popped up in my lectures and everything, but one of the things that I really came to admire very much, I hadn't thought that much about, was, you know, his capacity for self-education. This is a guy who had 1 year of formal schooling in his whole life. He didn't go to college, he didn't go to high school, barely went to grade school. But he was always learning. He was always, I tell my students, look at Lincoln, you know, you're never finished learning. This guy was a guy who was self-educated his whole life. He developed an amazing command of the English language. You know, I think second maybe only to Jefferson among our presidents. He had this eloquence, this ability to write, ability to convey his views to ordinary people in a very powerful way. And I came to really admire that in a way, not just his policies, but his language and his command of the language and his ability to communicate. I think I hadn't quite appreciated that when I started working on this book. I hadn't appreciated before that as much as I do now.
The movie that was made about his life a few years ago got a lot of acclaim. What do you think of it? Was it pretty accurate in some ways?
Well, you know, what historians think is accurate and what Hollywood thinks is accurate is not the same thing. Accurate to them is, are the costumes right? You know, is the guy in the Civil War scene carrying the right rifle? You know. It was fine. It's not really history. It's historical fiction, which is a perfectly fine genre. I mean, Shakespeare did a lot of that, right? Right. But you don't go to Julius Caesar by Shakespeare. Is that really the way Julius Caesar was? Possibly not, you know. I think it was a well-made movie. It focused. I think Hollywood. The problem with those movies is whether it's Gandhi, Lincoln, Malcolm X, you name it. It's always the great man theory of history. One person drives the history. These are all great men, but they're not. They didn't determine everything that happened all by themselves. So when you get out into a more complicated view of history, it's a little harder, I think, for Hollywood to put that into a movie.
Maybe sometimes those encourage someone, though, to learn more about.
Well, that is exactly the
person.
point. If people saw the movie and then went out and read a book about Lincoln or about the Civil War or about slavery and emancipation, that's all to the good. If the movie inspires you to become more interested, that's great. If all you know is what you saw in the movie, you've got a pretty narrow view of what was going on at that time.
Well, thanks so much for coming into the studio today and sharing some of your insights on that.
I'm happy to be here. Nice to talk to you.